The Hyundai Santa Fe 2.2-litre turbo diesel is the 7-seater that you've been sleeping on. Now, if you follow the channel, you would have seen our review of the Hyundai Santa Fe Hybrid, which runs a 1.6-litre turbocharged 4-cylinder petrol engine, as well as a small electric motor with power going to the front wheels. This is a distinctly different affair, because not only does power go to all 4 wheels, the gearbox is now an 8-speed auto, and under the bonnet, you will find a 2.2-litre turbo diesel producing 202 PS and 440 Newton meters of torque. That torque figure is, of course, the most important figure and the one we'll focus on, because it's available from just 1,750 RPM, which means that this car can absolutely rocket ahead should you want to. Genting runs? No problem. Now, the Hyundai Santa Fe for 2025 could be seen as a heavy facelift because that is broadly what it is. Up front, you now get a redesigned set of lights where you have the daytime running light that now bleeds into the main headlight unit, which is now itself broader and connected to the grille. The grille is now also wider than ever before, giving this car a much more distinctive front end. I also appreciate the very extensive use of silver trim in order to make this front end look a little bit more menacing. Now, although, again, this can be considered a heavy facelift, the Hyundai Santa Fe for 2025 actually sits on a brand new platform, which means that while this design may appear to be very familiar, what's going on underneath and the way this car is built has changed significantly, and the benefits of that are best experienced from behind the wheel, but we'll get to that a little bit later. Now, moving down the side, rolling stock is handled by a set of 20-inch alloy wheels done up with a diamond cut finish on the front, wrapped in Continental tires. Now, notably, these wheels are 1 inch larger in diameter compared to the 1.6 turbo hybrid, and I do think that because this is the slightly more performance-oriented model, even though it doesn't compromise in fuel economy, I do appreciate the slightly more aggressive tires. More importantly, because of that torque figure, you want to be able to put that power down through all 4 wheels via a set of wider rubbers. Moving further down, you get more of that silver contrasting down on the bottom. You get a set of functional roof rails up here, which are very useful to use because there is no sunroof anymore. The wing mirrors are mounted on the door, which means that you actually have very good visibility out this way, and you also have your 360 camera mounted down there. Now, as we move further down the side, this is not a small car by any measure. The Hyundai Santa Fe is a D-segment SUV, a proper 3-row 7-seater, which is why the Santa Fe is as popular as it is in markets like Europe and North America, because it offers an excellent amount of practicality, and of course, it's got the road presence to match. However, one of the things I would like to point out about this is that while it has a very long wheelbase, which allows for a lot of space inside, this car still enjoys a good degree of agility. The second part I'd like to point out is the fact that you can access the inside of the car via the key, obviously, to unlock it, but of course you have the remote latch unlock on both door handles, on the left and right front doors. However, being a Korean car, this is a button, unlike a touch sensor that you get on slightly more modern cars, like a Toyota. I don't know why the Koreans insist on this. At the back of the Santa Fe, there are now a new set of full LED tail lights, replete with LED indicators, as well as this piece of red trim here to make it look like a light bar, although obviously it is not. The brake lights live up here. However, the indicators are not here, they're here. I find that very irritating because LED light technology has improved so much that you could have integrated those indicators up here, but instead they are on the bumper. More annoyingly, the space up here, those are the reverse lights. Anyway, you still have the Santa Fe badging there, replete with a little Santa Fe sun, which I always think is quite cute, whereas on this side you find H-Track 2.2D. These are the only ways for you to tell that this is the diesel, at least from the rear, compared to the hybrid, because obviously on the hybrid it doesn't say H-Track because it's front-wheel drive, and obviously it says hybrid instead. You no longer get visible exhaust pipes as you did previously, but I do think the back end of the Santa Fe has aged quite well, although I would have appreciated if they had hidden this up here, the way they have on the Kia Sorento. Now, if I open this tailgate, you'll find a pretty good amount of space back here. Now, the majority of Santa Fe customers actually use their cars as 5+2s, which means that this third row is usually left down here. Now, with the third row down, this is a huge amount of space, easily outdoing anything that you can get from, say, a Honda CR-V or even a Haval H6 HEV, for example, because obviously this is a 3-row SUV. Now, what I appreciate is the fact that even though this is a 3-row SUV, there is actually space underneath the boot floor to hide the parcel shelf should you need to deploy that third row. And more importantly, this car comes as standard with a carpet that actually covers all the way to the backs of the second row, which means that this looks, to the untrained eye, like just a very large SUV with a very large boot. Now, with the third row up, there is a pretty decent amount of space, certainly large enough for maybe 2 or 4 soft bags if you stack them on top of each other, which means that this is a pretty decently practical car. However, if you are looking to carry more people more of the time, then perhaps a 3-row SUV is not for you and you'd be better served in an MPV, like a Hyundai Staria or a Kia Carnival. Now, the interior of the Santa Fe has also been given a significant rework compared to the pre-facelift model. And a lot of that has to do with material quality as well as small efficiencies that have been eked out in order to make this car even more practical than it's ever been before. So, for example, we have lost the physical gear selector, which now makes way for a button-type affair like we've seen from a lot of Hyundai electric models. Now, as a result of using this, that's freed up space underneath the center console, where you have a huge amount of space here, which is rubberized, which means things don't roll about, while still providing access to some power sockets down here, making this quite practical. That also means that up here there are a couple of cup holders with a USB-A port in order to provide phone mirroring, although that's also available wirelessly. And there's also a wireless charger here, which is a vertical orientation, which I think is quite a smart use of space. And back here, there is a pretty decent amount of space, certainly very deep indeed, about half of my forearm. And there's even a little tray up here, which is removable, which means that if you have smaller items, you can just keep that in there rather than have them rattle about and lose themselves within the space beneath. Now, in addition to these design upgrades, there have also been upgrades in terms of material quality, because obviously the Santa Fe was always very well built, but now it's gotten even better. For example, this dash top is now covered in faux leather replete with stitching, and that even stretches all the way down here into the center console. It's not until you reach all the way down here you find harder wearing but scratchier plastics. The same goes for the steering wheel, which now gets a higher grade leather than before, and the dash top itself, the door tops for example, these are all nice soft touch materials, more stitching, more of that faux leather on the doors, which I think does help to make this cabin look and feel a little bit more upmarket. This head unit has also been upgraded, which is now a larger screen than before, and like I mentioned, also offers wireless Apple CarPlay and Android Auto, which is always nice to see, while the digital instrument cluster remains as before, which is great because it's very legible, very easy to find all the information that you need, and more importantly, it also integrates the blind spot view monitor that was first popularized by Hyundai and Kia quite some time ago, and it is still a feature that I recommend very highly. In addition to this, there's also a full color heads-up display which gives you various information such as your music, as well as your speed and your speed limit, as well as your ADAS functions, and a readout for your blind spot monitor, which means that if there is a vehicle in your blind spot, it actually reads on the heads-up display first, which means you don't even need to move your eye toward the mirrors in order to figure that out, which I think is great. Now, one of the other things that have changed with this car is actually in terms of the screen display, because we used to get a bank of HVAC controls down here replete with their own readouts for the temperature. Now that has changed, because whenever you manipulate the HVAC control, the readout actually comes out up here on the infotainment system. However, the HVAC controls themselves remain nice and analog, which means that you actually have rocker switches for your temperature, you have physical buttons for your fan speed, as well as various other functionality that lives here. That's great, because Hyundai understands that it is important for drivers to have tactile feedback when they're manipulating things that they will be touching very often. So this is a fantastic choice. The same goes down here where you have your H-track control system, which basically functions very similarly to sort of Land Rover's terrain response, where you can choose between your drive modes as well as your off-road modes via this toggle switch here, as well as have access to things like your hill descent control, your auto start stop, auto hold, blah blah blah, all that lives here. Now, one thing about the center console that I'm not a big fan of is the blank buttons. There are 5 of them that I've counted down here, because these are buttons for functions that we do not get. For example, heated and ventilated seats, we don't get that. Heated steering wheel, we also don't get that. Now, while I understand that we don't need heating, ventilation would have been nice. More importantly, I don't understand why these buttons had to remain here at all. Wouldn't it have just been easier to not offer the buttons altogether? Now, talking of buttons, there are also a bunch of buttons here in the steering wheel, which is also nice to see, because these control things like your ADAS functionality as well as your entertainment functions, all very easy, all very simple to use, and all very intuitive and tactile, which is always nice to see. There are also paddle shifters back here to manipulate the 8-speed automatic gearbox, where you still have physical indicators and wiper stalks here. It's 2025, I have to actually say these things now. Now, in terms of ergonomics, it is actually pretty good. You get 2 powered front seats, replete with lumbar adjustment for the driver. And of course, this steering wheel is very adjustable, which means that it's very easy to find a comfortable driving position, which means that for the last 400, 500-ish kilometers I've done in this car, it has been very comfortable indeed. And I think that overall this interior is quite nice, bathed in ambient, customizable ambient lighting. And I think that this is befitting its 200,000 ringgit price tag, although I'm made to understand that if you walk into a showroom today, you won't be paying 200,000 ringgit. Now, in the back of the Hyundai Santa Fe, being a large D-segment SUV with the front seat set up in my driving position, I have a pretty good amount of knee room and a pretty good amount of headroom. And more importantly, I can also recline these rear seats to a pretty ridiculous angle if I want to take a nap. However, you may be surprised by the amount of space here, but that's because these seats sit on rails, which means that I can actually extend this further back, but I wanted to demonstrate this to you first. Because even with these seats set up in the furthest forward position, because they're actually set quite high off the floor, I still have very good under-thigh support even if I don't stretch my feet out underneath the seat in front of me, which I can also do because the front seats are also set up quite high. More importantly, Hyundai has also set this up in terms of concert seating, which means that my shoulder height is actually higher than the person in front of me, which means I have a very good view out. Now, of course, if I were to push these seats all the way to the rear, as you can see, I now have acres of knee room, although headroom remains unchanged. And of course, I can still stretch my feet in underneath the seat in front of me. Sat back here, life is pretty good. Material quality is just as good as it is in the front, with soft touch material up here, more stitched faux leather down here. These seats are nice and comfortable with decent side support, surprisingly enough. And because this car is quite wide, a 5th passenger sat in the middle will not feel too cramped, and the floor is nice and flat, so there is place for them to put their feet. There are a couple of USB-A ports, slightly disappointing because I would have preferred USB-C, but you do get a couple of crotch coolers. I would have also preferred either vents up here on the ceiling or vents in the B-pillar, but there we are. There are obviously ISOFIX mounts for these 2 rear seats, a couple of deployable cup holders here, and you even get sun blinds here, which is great should you have small children that may be sensitive to UV rays. In addition to all of this, obviously you have relatively large door bins, decently sized rear pockets on the backs of the front seats, and this front seat can actually be moved via a set of boss switches on the side. Additionally, if you have a bulky rear-facing child seat and you're concerned about clearance back here, you can actually mount the ISOFIX mounted seat in the front seat in order to provide maximum flexibility in terms of how you want things to be laid out. Because you can put a bulky rear-facing child seat on the front seat, push that all the way to the front, and then there's more space for an adult to be sat back here. Now, of course, this being a 3-row SUV, there is pretty decent access to the 3rd row. If you just press this button here, this seat will fold out of the way, allowing for easier ingress and egress into the 3rd row. However, life in the 3rd row is not so great. The thing is, with this seat set up in its furthest rearward position, I have about a finger's width of space, although obviously this seat can be slid forward for extra room. However, even if this row were to be moved forwards, unfortunately, as you can see, I have no under-thigh support. The 3rd row is basically made for children, or if you must put an adult back here, don't put them back here for very long. That said, however, weirdly, the air conditioning setup back here is actually better than it is in the front, because I actually have vents right here, kind of where my chest is on either side, replete with a little switch in order to control the rear AC. I get cup holders, there's even a little bin here for some storage, and there's even a USB-A port on the right side. Although, of course, if you are using this as a 5+2, you will appreciate the fact that you can actually fold this set of seats from the 3rd row, or rather from the tailgate, by just pulling on a handle. And of course, if you want to fold the 2nd row flat, there are even electronic buttons here in order to fold these down. So if I just press this, as you can see, it will fold out of the way. Now, this, of course, makes this car incredibly practical, although obviously if you want to get in and out of this car from the 3rd row, there's also a button on the shoulder. Now, obviously, we've covered the fact that the Santa Fe is a very practical 3-row SUV, which is what you'd expect from a 3-row family SUV. However, I think the biggest surprise of this car, especially after having driven the hybrid, is actually from the front seat. Now, as I mentioned earlier, the Santa Fe that we're driving today is powered by the 2.2-litre turbo diesel. Notably, this is the only powertrain you can have if you want all-wheel drive. But more importantly, there is something to be said about a pure internal combustion powertrain. You see, with a hybrid, it makes a lot more sense when you drive about in town because you have that electric assistance, giving you a little bit more efficiency when you're moving off the line, for example, and therefore reducing stress on the engine, which makes sense when you have a relatively small 1.6-litre turbocharged mill powering what is ultimately still a very large 3-row SUV. However, that is not the case with this diesel though, because this engine is brawny enough to power this car along without any fuss whatsoever. 440 Newton meters of torque is not to be scoffed at. That is more than enough to get this car to simply pick up and go. It goes like a stabbed rat. But the thing is, when you're driving a vehicle like this, and ultimately if you're a buyer of a vehicle like this, you're not really too concerned with trying to drive like Speedy Gonzales. That's not really the point. What you want from a big torquey engine like this is the ability to maintain speed and to overtake effortlessly, and that is exactly what this engine does. It has been a long time since I've driven a nice diesel mill like this, and honestly, I'm reminded immediately as to why they are so incredibly popular. Because not only do they provide excellent torque figures, they are also incredibly efficient, which I will touch on a little bit later. But sat from here doing urban speeds like I am now, the engine is a little bit noticeable. Yes, you can hear some clatter from the diesel up front. You can't really run away from it. This is life with a diesel engine. My diesel BMW makes the same kind of noises. In fact, they might be a bit louder. But once you start to hit cruising speeds at about 70 plus kilometers an hour, you barely hear a thing. And more importantly, when you're trying to overtake, because the car doesn't have to reach ridiculously high RPMs, the engine doesn't make itself any more known than it does at idle. And in fact, even when you are idling, yes, there is a little bit of rattle from the engine, but not that much. Not enough for me to say that this car feels unrefined or uncouth. This car is perfectly fine, excellent, more than serviceable in fact. And then comes the matter of refinement, because while you may think that being able to hear the engine and having a little bit of rattle might make this car unrefined, I beg to differ. For example, all of the glass in the front are all dual laminate glass, which means that it does an excellent job of cutting out wind and road noise. In fact, bikes go past this car and it's just sort of a suggestion more than anything else, which I think is absolutely excellent again for a vehicle like this for about 200,000 ringgit. And then of course, when you do get up to motorway speeds, or in fact exceed the motorway speed limit, you will find that wind noise and road noise are also very, very well suppressed, which means that this is a car that you can comfortably do miles in without any concern whatsoever. This is an excellent family car in that regard. And then we touch on to consumption. Now, as I mentioned, running a diesel engine like this means that it is relatively efficient, and I will say that this car has done brilliantly. Now, when you were to drive on a motorway run, open roads, etc., you can expect to see numbers broadly around sort of about 5.5 liters to the 100 to 6.5 liters to the 100, which I think is absolutely incredible for a vehicle like this. But what stunned me more than anything else was how efficient this car was in traffic, because I got stuck in a 1.5 hour snarl to cover about 50-ish kilometers. And in that stop-start traffic with the adaptive cruise control running, doing most of the work for me, this car was still reporting 7.2 liters to the 100, which is broadly the same number that you would have gotten from the turbo hybrid while still having 440 Newton meters of torque. That, to me, is excellent. Which means that overall, this car has a cruising range in excess, comfortably in excess of 850 kilometers. In fact, I wouldn't be surprised if with a little bit more gentle throttle input, which obviously I haven't been doing, you could probably eke out 900 to 1,000 kilometers on a tank in this car, which I think is, again, very impressive for a vehicle like this, particularly with the performance on offer. Now, the final point I want to touch on before the conclusion is safety, because the Korean brands have done very, very well in this regard, and the Santa Fe is no different. For the Max models, you get the full gamut of active safety features, which include things like autonomous emergency braking, adaptive cruise control, you get lane keep assist, blind spot monitoring, a fantastic 360-degree camera, rear cross traffic alert, as well as the blind spot view monitor that I mentioned earlier, which gives you a feed of your blind spot when you indicate from the instrument cluster. All very, very good things. But in addition to simply offering these features, what I'd like to touch on is the polish of these features. Because Hyundai and Kia naturally have been doing this for a very long time, the way these features are executed are absolutely excellent. They really do provide an example of what it's like to buy a car from a company that has been making cars for a long time. People who understand the logic behind a new car, because this car is engineered like a car, and therefore all these features work the way you would expect them to as an experienced driver. The ADAS suite in this car is something that I could rely upon every day. It is something that is very comfortable, very easy for me to use, and it remains a highlight of every Korean car that I drive. Now, of course, the Hyundai Santa Fe is not alone in the D segment space. There is, of course, the Kia Sorento, which runs a slightly more updated engine with the SmartStream D powertrain, which is a bit newer than the CRDI mill that is currently available in this car. And of course, with the newer powertrain, of course, the 5-year limited mileage warranty that comes as standard from Burma's, naturally that car is a little bit more expensive. And of course, if you want to buy your D-segment SUV to use as a 5-seater and not as a 5+2 or a 7-seater like this car is, then of course there is the much vaunted Amoda C9. Of course, compared to this, that car runs a 2-litre turbocharged 4-cylinder with all-wheel drive, a little bit over 200,000 ringgit, which means that naturally your fuel consumption goes up, but of course that car has its own selling points. So if you ask me, if I were a potential buyer of a 7-seater or a 5+2 3-row SUV, and I want to cover endless distance in maximum comfort and with very little fuel consumption, then this is the car that I would recommend. Because the Hyundai Santa Fe not only looks distinctive, but it drives in a very, very polished fashion. In fact, I'd argue this is even slightly more refined than what you get from the Kia Sorento. On top of that, from what I'm made to understand, currently, no one is paying sticker price for the current crop of Hyundai products, which means that if you happen to be on the market for one of these right now, you could get a pretty good deal from your nearest Hyundai SIAM dealer. So overall, this is a car that I would very easily recommend, and if you are shopping within this segment, this is certainly something worth considering. I know that many people who have seen this car among friends and acquaintances who have driven this car on my recommendation have all come back and said glowing things about it, which means that if you're on the market for a car like this, you should also be as suitably impressed with this as I am. In any case, that concludes our review of the Hyundai Santa Fe 2.2-litre turbo diesel all-wheel drive. If you enjoyed this video, please give it a thumbs up, subscribe to the channel, hit the little bell icon to notified every time we make a new upload. Don't forget to follow us on Facebook, Twitter and Instagram. All the links are in the description below, including the link to join our new WhatsApp channel. Thank you so much for watching. We'll catch you in the next one. Take care, stay safe, and jangan bodoh.